Hello Unwrappers, Ollie here. Just before we get going, humour me as I take a minute of your time to inform you that this bank holiday weekend there is an extra reason to try the Week magazine. If you sign up for a free trial by Monday, you'll get a free coffee table book, The Art of the Week, as well as your first 6 issues of the magazine for free. The Art of the Week contains more than 250 sketches and paintings by our cover artist, Howard McWilliam, spanning more than 30 years of political coverage. It's quite cool. To get this very special free gift, visit theweek.co.uk/offer and enter code HOLIDAY by midnight on Monday the 31st of May. That's the code HOLIDAY at theweek.co.uk/offer. And now, on with the show. It's the week ending Saturday the 29th of May, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen a devastating account of Boris Johnson's number 10 from his former right-hand man, Dominic Cummings, Manchester United losing in the Europa League final against Villarreal to penalties, and the death of Eric Carle, artist and author of The Very Hungry Caterpillar, at the age of 91. But we're here to bring you some of the stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news, not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann, and let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from the Week's digital team, new girl Kate Samuelson from The Week magazine, editor Theo Tait, and the icing on the podcast cake, freelancer Suchandrika Chakrabarti. Now, Kate, as is tradition, I'm going to kick off your debut appearance on the show by asking you to tell us something about yourself we would not be able to Google.
I always hate questions like this as they make me feel so boring.
Well, we couldn't Google that.
But I'm both ginger and left-handed, which I think puts me in a very exclusive group of less than 1% of the world's population. Is that a good enough fact about myself?
Very enlightening. Thank you, Kate. So, Chandrika, you're starting this week. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
So you can have the designer outfit of your dreams, but only until midnight next Friday.
I mean, the pandemic has made everyone more of a digital consumer, more comfortable with shopping digitally. I think it has also created this pent-up demand for more social engagement. We see it in the travel industry. We see it in hotel bookings. We see it, movie theaters are opening, restaurant reservations, weddings that are being rebooked. So all these indicators and signs, including the rental of dresses, I think is going to put us on a great trajectory to be even bigger than we were before.
Jenny Fleiss, the co-founder of Rent the Runway, talking to Yahoo Finance last month. So, Chandrika, what is Rent the Runway and what's happened this week?
So Rent the Runway is a premier subscription fashion service. You can borrow up to 4 pieces of designer clothing that you might have seen on a celebrity, and it costs between $89 up to $199 for different kinds of subscriptions. So in Britain that would be £63 up to £84.
So when you say that you might have seen on a celebrity, it's not literally the one Cate Blanchett wore to the BAFTAs, or it might be, but it's more, you see it on Instagram, you think, I can't afford that, I'll rent it.
Yeah, you can get something very similar to it, but I think in some cases with certain premier subscription services you can get the same one, and then you get to rent it for a couple of weeks and then you have to send it back, so you never get to own it.
And so why is this your story of the week, Suchandrika? It's just a startup, and actually, as far as I can tell, they haven't been doing very well recently. The pandemic hit them quite hard.
Yeah, so their chief executive Jennifer Hyman spoke to the New York Times this week, and she said during the pandemic the company was doing pretty badly. They closed 5 retail stores, they laid off or furloughed half of their staff, and they dropped their unlimited subscription option. So there was an option to get as many items of clothing sent to you and sent back within a month as you wanted. But this month, users have been coming back to the service in absolute droves. Since that pandemic low last May, there's been a 92% increase in active subscribers. So partly there are discounts luring them back, but also they're on track to outpace their 2019 levels by the end of the year. So Rent the Runway is looking at a huge boom, and they're not the only ones.
Okay. I mean, Kate, do you think this is a temporary boost for Rent the Runway and other associated companies like that, simply because people have been locked in their homes? They're now having the first opportunities to go out to parties. It's summertime. Maybe they want to wear a really exciting, colourful dress that they wouldn't particularly want to own. But this is a moment in time and it'll pass, or do you think they're here to stay?
I'm not sure. I think it's part of a real kind of growing trend and move away from the sort of wear it once culture. Certainly in recent times, and definitely over lockdown, as you said, there's been a bit of a move away from fast fashion. A big example of this is probably the huge backlash against Miss Guyder's £1 bikini a couple of years ago. And these days there's a massive emphasis on slow fashion, which is the movement that prioritises the buying of better quality clothes that will last longer, and it also places a value on the fair treatment of people and the planet along the way.
Yeah, but when it comes to the planet, Theo, I mean, this stuff is being shipped out to people via car. So, I mean, there is an ecological consequence to that, isn't there? There's an environmental amount that's being paid that's maybe invisible when you're thinking of being an eco-warrior by renting rather than buying.
I would have thought that it's quite easy to balance that out, given the sort of massive inputs that go into actually making clothing in the first place. I mean, it's something like that. It's the fourth sector in the world in terms of its detrimental impact. The EU thinks only housing, transport, and food are worse. And the main things is that it uses a lot of land, it uses a lot of water, it uses a lot of fertilizer. I suppose if anything that can get you to sort of row back from this fast fashion world and to have things reused, particularly when it's to do with trends which are going much faster than the piece of clothing actually need to be used, then I would have thought it was a good idea.
I mean, maybe it's a bit of a media way of looking at it, though, Suchandrika, to say it's part of the end of fast fashion, because that's the kind of thing people talk about on Twitter. Whereas in reality, there are queues at Primark as well, aren't there, as they reopen at the moment. And you could see it as the same trend, i.e. cheap clothing. I mean, actually renting expensive clothing is cheaper than buying it, so it's cheap clothing. It's no different to fast fashion.
What we had between 2000 and 2014 was that clothing production doubled. The average consumer was buying 60% more pieces of clothing compared to 15 years ago, so compared to sort of the 80s to 90s. And yet each piece of clothing was kept half along. So there has been a definite ramp up in how quickly and how often we buy clothes, how long we keep them for, and at what point we throw them away. And so this has got much worse, definitely since the 80s. And you've got to think about, well, why? And I was thinking about this, there's the internet, there's Instagram, there was Flickr before that, but also there was a kind of the drinking culture days that was more back in the noughties. And all these things have kind of really changed over the last 20 years. Younger people are going out less for that reason, but perhaps want to look as though they have a great wardrobe at their disposal online.
Yeah, let's talk about that age point, actually, Kate. I'm going to be bold and say, in addition to being ginger and left-handed, you're probably the youngest person on the podcast this week. Do you think your generation is more inclined to do this than they might have been 10 years ago?
I think so. I think that's definitely true. I mean, we're Generation Rent, aren't we? I'm sure I speak for a lot of people of my generation when I say that I'm a big fan of the sharing economy. I use the free food sharing app Olio. I'm dying to try Borrow My Doggy. When I go away, remember those days when you could go away, I'd always stay in an Airbnb. I used Uberpool, or at least I used to pre-pandemic. Don't really fancy it so much now.
So the idea of like a designer dress, like if you could afford one or if you saved up to buy one, if you had £400 for a dress, does that just seem ridiculous?
Yeah, I think it does. It does feel quite bizarre. And I think a lot of people of my generation, but also other generations, kind of saw lockdown as a time when they really reevaluated what was important, what they wanted to be spending their money on. They sorted through their wardrobe, they saw how many unworn clothes they have, and they kind of thought about what's important and what they want to be spending their money on once they can spend it again.
I wonder if this is a female thing as well, Theo. I don't know if you've had a look at any of the websites in terms of what they offer men, but I had a flick through and, women get Chanel handbags and Vivienne Westwood jumpsuits and all the rest of it. The men's stuff is so drab. It's like literally borrow some stuff from Moss Bros. You can get a new suit every month, or you can get a £35 Calvin Klein T-shirt that you can rent for a tenner. I mean, it's not just drab, it's disappointing, really. Do you think there's room for men to do this too?
I would have thought so. I'm probably not the person to ask as being quite slow fashion. But I would have thought there would be plenty of opportunity to do that. They're probably just not marketing it right.
So do you think this is the next... Actually, there is an evolution for men and these websites are a bit behind the curve on it, possibly. I mean, they really don't seem to be targeting men. It's all about women.
Well, the overall spend by women is just much bigger, isn't it, than men on fashion. So I imagine that's where you start. But give it time to evolve.
I mean, is it a disaster still, Suchandrika, to be seen in the same outfit twice? I mean, that's sort of part of the reason why women historically have spent more on fashion, isn't it? There seems to be a bit more judgment. Men can wear the same classic suit 7 days a week. Where do we stand on that at the moment? If people are concerned about fast fashion, What's wrong with just buying one nice dress and wearing it all the time?
Yeah, well, I think that most people on social media, there's a record of what we wear. For a lot of us, we do take pictures of our outfit of the day, we'll put it online, other people see it and admire it, and then it's like, well, I can't really wear that again. But also, I would say that we need to look at the marketing of these websites. So we've just mentioned that there's Moss Bros, who've launched Moss Box, and that's for menswear. But isn't it a case of like the so-called women's pages in the media are going to showcase all of these fashion rental websites, but there isn't really a corresponding male media in the same way? So the kind of the menswear angle gets lost a bit. And actually, there could be more. They could do more with menswear. And menswear isn't necessarily just for men. Like, I could rent a tuxedo if we could find one for someone who's 5'3", which is a challenge. But, you know, women could wear tuxedos, as Harry Styles has shown, and we talked about a couple of months ago on this show, like, you can have men wearing skirts. So actually, I think there's a marketing opportunity here to have menswear. Men already rent tuxedos. So actually, I'd say primed and ready for menswear, the market.
I guess the thing is, Kate, this kind of startup still creates demand for people to be wearing something new all the time. And maybe, as Suchandrika was suggesting, that's sort of accelerated by Instagram and that kind of thing. But it's not really going to combat the issues that the clothing and textile industry have with pollution, with waste, because the demand is still there and it's being fueled by this kind of thing.
Yeah, I would say that actually one of the kind of main, and there aren't many, but one of the main criticisms against rental fashion is that it does still fuel this idea of, you know, wearing something new all the time, and if anything, it actually makes it easier for people to do. There are big trends on social media, like the outfit of the day trend, #OOTD. I don't know if that's familiar to you or not, but that's been used on more than 270 million posts. It's used by celebrities, influencers, but also ordinary people, and it really fuels this sense of needing to kind of wear something new all the time, and whether that's buying or renting, it still has consequences for the environment.
I also wonder as well, Theo, whether, you know, had we been having this conversation pre-pandemic, it might have been seen as a good thing for people to transition away from the high street for ethical reasons. But, you know, we're now in a stage where Debenhams is gone, Arcadia is gone. There's actually a sense of supporting jobs and supporting the high street for communities is important, even if there are moral considerations around ethics that counterbalance that.
It's true. If people don't get out to Primark, our city centres will become a howling void of kind of, you know, emptiness. I think definitely, yeah. I mean, you know, I think that they've had such a terrible time, and so many big brands have gone, and so many flagship shops have gone, and anchor places where, you know, the sort of the Debenhams and lots of John Lewis's being closed down, which would have usually sort of given a whole sort of ecosystem of other shops around them. That you know, I think there are good reasons for not doing too much shopping online as much as possible.
So Chandrika, just finish us off on this by doing the hard sell on why we should do it, though. I mean, obviously you've chosen it as your story of the week because you think this is a sort of unstoppable rise in this sector. What are the stats around clothing pollution and waste that are being avoided by people participating in rental schemes?
So, yeah, because this isn't a trend that's creating new clothes, we've got a situation where the clothing industry is only second to oil in terms of being the largest polluter in the world. And then according to the United Nations Climate Change News, the fashion industry contributes 10% of global greenhouse gas emissions due to its long supply chains and energy-intensive production. And nearly 20% of global wastewater is produced by the fashion industry, which surprised me. But if you really want to be convinced, I've got the main poster woman for this trend. It is, of course, icon of relatability, Gwyneth Paltrow. And so she's joining the board of Rent the Runway, and she was asked, does that mean that she's going to use her subscription? And she said, what's fascinating is that in my own way, I've been renting the runway for years, borrowing a dress from a designer for a single moment at a premiere or an awards show, then giving it back afterwards. You know, that's what actresses of her calibre do. So I think that the distance between your normal person who loves celebrities and celebrities themselves has flattened in the pandemic. We use the same mediums, don't we? Like that Imagine video was just a video on social media. I can make one, you can make one. They use Zoom. What's the difference between us? And now we can act as though we are going to the Oscars every day. I think there's something special about that people need after the pandemic.
That's interesting. But Hollywood is going to intervene to make sure there always is a gulf between celebrities and us. So what is the next thing then? Like, what is Gwyneth Paltrow going to be wearing to the Oscars? Because it can't be haute couture anymore that she's borrowing. It has to be completely personalised, bespoke haute couture that's presumably burned the minute it comes off her body.
Yeah, and this is where I'm breaking some news on the podcast. She will be wearing Primark, as she has mentioned. Without me wearing Primark, Hollywood will be a howling void. I believe Theo Tait said that on a podcast. So that's what I'll be supporting.
And we should say, just for the record, I'm wearing a Tesco T-shirt today. This was a £5. I don't know what you're wearing. Could you just tell our viewers what you're wearing, Suchandrika?
Primark hoodie. Oh, T-shirt from Georgia Aston. Honestly, trousers from Matalan. Like, I am not wealthy, guys. I'm sorry to tell you.
I presume you are renting that for £40 a month. OK, Kate, you're up next after this.
This podcast is brought to you by Aria Resorts Homes, providing sensational holiday homes and staycation investments. Aria Resorts sells luxurious holiday homes in top UK locations, with a 7% annual net return available to qualifying investors at a choice of 3 resorts. Terms and conditions apply. Find out more by searching Aria Resorts Investment.
OK, time for our next story now. And just a content warning, we are about to touch on issues of terminal illness and suicide. Kate, what do you think this week should be remembered for?
Is there an end in sight for the UK's ban on assisted dying?
To introduce a bill to enable adults who are terminally ill to be provided at their request with specified assistance to end their own life and for connected purposes. I beg to move that this bill is now read a first time.
Baroness Meacher introducing her bill on assisted dying to the House of Lords on Wednesday. Kate, what does the bill propose?
So this private member's bill on assisted dying, it was proposed, as you heard just now in the clip, by someone called Baroness Meacher, and she said that she wants to alleviate what she describes as intolerable suffering. She says that it's a basic human right for us to have some control over what happens to us at the end of our lives and to be able to die with dignity. So under the new bill, people, to qualify, for want of a better word, for legally assisted dying, you need to be an adult who's terminally ill, you need to be mentally competent, so people with dementia, for example, wouldn't qualify, and you also need to be in the final 6 months of your life.
And why do you think it is that phrase, intolerable suffering, which she mentioned, isn't in the text of the bill? It's not in those criteria that you just listed. Because that would open it up to a lot more people, wouldn't it? That would open it up to someone who's perhaps in their 30s or 40s who says, I'm suffering intolerably, but I'm not, medically certifiably in the final 6 months of my life.
Yeah, it's actually a pretty conservative bill, and you have to meet all 3 requirements to be able to qualify for it. And if you do then qualify, it feels strange to be using that term, but if you do, then the patient can die in a manner, time and place of their choosing.
But why? Why is it conservative bill? Why aren't those people included, do you think?
Politicians in the UK have historically been opposed to the bill, although, interestingly, in recent years, actually there's a huge amount of public support. So in 2019, a poll found that nearly 85% of British people support the right to die. And interestingly, 79% of people of faith do. And actually, in terms of kind of official policy, the British Medical Association has historically opposed all forms of assisted dying. But a survey last year of doctors, also by the British Medical Association, which is the doctors' union, they found that half were in favour of a change in the law. And I think traditionally MPs have been quite influenced by the opinion of the doctors.
But that does mean, Suchandrika, that half of doctors aren't in favour of changing the law. And you do sort of think that appears to be the tipping point that we're struggling to reach, doesn't it? The public historically have supported the position of supporting assisted dying in certain cases for years, for decades. But the politicians haven't because the doctors haven't.
Yeah, it does make you wonder if it's a generational thing with doctors, if we're seeing a changeover of generations. And also which jobs the doctors do, because there'll be a lot of doctors who do not work with people at the ends of their lives, who are much earlier on in the chain of referring patients. So do they have a different opinion and a different idea of what this would involve, as opposed to doctors who work in geriatric medicine who see it every day, or doctors who work in cancer and perhaps see this often? So I do think it's about witnessing people suffering terribly and not being allowed to die, and also seeing the court cases that happened. So there are examples of people being on trial for murder because they've helped their spouse die, and surely that is not the right way to go about these things. Surely there was such desperation they had to do that.
Well, some people think, Theo, and by some people I suppose I mean opponents to this kind of law, think that is exactly the right place to make these decisions. That actually a court then can look at all the evidence and decide whether or not someone has murdered someone or help them end their life in a humane way, and that's the place to do it. It's not up to a doctor to make that decision. It shouldn't be up to a spouse. A court can do that. So we don't need to change the law. Suicide is legal. Many doctors have spoken publicly about intervening to speed up the death of someone who has days or weeks to live and is already in a lot of suffering, and our prisons are not full of those doctors. So things don't need to change. We have a system for this.
Well, I would disagree with that, really, because for a start, this would have a more sensible legal system for looking at. A High Court judge will look at it. Secondly, at the moment, no one wants to really prosecute people for helping their spouse die or their family member die. So usually what happens is some kind of fudge where the prosecutors let it go or the police let it go, or so at the moment it's kind of a dishonest system.
Yeah, someone's found not guilty for something they clearly did,
yeah,
because there's a moral reason for understanding it, which is a bit difficult, isn't it, legally?
Yeah, I mean, how many juries are going to convict someone in those situations? I mean, it is a for up to 14 years in prison you get on the Suicide Act, which is pretty unreasonable, I think.
I mean, it's worth saying, Theo, isn't it, that this is a bit of a classic, this debate. I know it's the topic that Radio 4's Moral Maze have covered more than any other. It's one that must have come up a lot in your editorship. I mean, how do you think the terms of the debate have been changing over the years?
Well, I think that overall we're seeing that that basically the sort of bastion of opposition to it is the faith community and the faith lobby and the lawmakers, the bishops, and that their influence is and the influence of sort of the doctrinal aspects of religion is definitely reducing. So I think that's why you're seeing quite a change in the sort of groundswell towards it at the moment. I mean, I think probably it is just a matter of time because the public support is so high.
Do you agree with that, Kate? Do you think, if you zoom out, maybe it isn't 10 years, maybe it's 100 years, but at some point it's obviously going to be the law here that you can facilitate assisted dying? Or do you think there'll always be this resistance?
I can see it happening. I mean, as I said earlier, public support is actually really high. And the UK is in some ways quite behind other countries. Lots of countries have now made assisted dying legal. Just to name a few, there's Switzerland, the Netherlands, Belgium, Canada, several United States, several US states, I should say. Even Ireland's parliament has voted to take a Dying with Dignity bill to its next stage. So I think the UK has a bit of catching up to do. And I think it does feel like this is something that we will see. As you said, it might be 10 years, it might be 100 years, but I imagine it will be sooner than 100 years. I'm
curious about when you just said even Ireland. What was the even representing there? Because they're a religious country, because of their views on abortion and stuff.
Yeah, I think what came to mind is that Ireland is a religious country, and in some ways, things like abortion law takes a longer time to come into effect there than it does in the UK. So I think that's why it was in my head. And as Theo said earlier, the kind of religious side of this debate is really important. And even recently, quite a few bishops have come out against this new reading of the bill. And clearly it's something that a lot of religions feel really strongly about, and religious people in this country.
You don't have to be religious, though, Suchandrika, do you, to just feel queasy about the state mandating to end anybody's life in any circumstances? People who are really against capital punishment for those reasons will then say something different about assisted dying because they believe it's compassionate, because someone's volunteering. But it is the same concern. The state is deciding who it is appropriate to execute.
Well, I think we're coming back to the intersection of law and medicine. In the case of capital punishment, it's law that's taking the precedence. But here we have two independent doctors as well as a High Court judge, and it's medicine that's taking precedence. It's health, but it's also the effect on the family. What's really important is to read the personal accounts of people who are dealing with this situation. So there's one on Sky News at the moment, and it's a man called Phil Newby who was diagnosed with motor neurone disease when he was 43. He's 50 now, so that's 7 years in which the disease has progressed. He launched a legal battle in the High High Court in 2019, and that bid was rejected by the Court of Appeal in 2020. And now his lungs are beginning to fail. He needs to use a ventilator for up to 2 hours a day, and he fears losing the ability to speak. Really hearing from people the fear of being locked into a body that won't work anymore is, a nightmare we can all relate to.
Although it is perfectly possible, and I mean this with the greatest respect to him and his family, of course it's a horrendous situation you just outlined, but it is perfectly possible for him to go to Switzerland. I mean, that option exists. It's not as if, I know it's a loophole, but, that is what people do, isn't it? If they really are serious about ending their lives and they want their family to help them.
So it costs up to £10,000. And I suppose we've just spoken about Ireland. It's the same argument we had about Ireland and abortion. It doesn't take into account the fear and horror of that journey, the cost of that journey, trying to hide that journey as well. So if it is 84% support, if there is acceptance of a sister dying, then it's worth letting someone make that choice to be in their home, to have the funeral where they want to have the funeral, and for their family to be all around them, and to give people that to at least look forward to. And it seems strange to look forward to death, but there are some illnesses and some conditions that are that bad. And I think it's for us to find that empathy with people who are going through that, to listen to them and to listen to doctors who can find the best and most comfortable way to end their lives, as scary as we find that.
Incidentally, Theo, I mean, this being raised in the House of Lords, I mean, it's significant because it hasn't been raised in Parliament at all for, I think, 5 years, but even if the House of Lords pass this bill, that doesn't become law, does it? It's the Lords raising it, not the Commons, right? So it's complicated.
Yeah. So the point about all private member bills is that in order to pass, they need government support. Even if the government doesn't whip it, which they probably won't because it's a matter of conscience, then what you need is the government to give it parliamentary time and to give some sort of sign of support to it. So really the crucial issue here is, what does the Conservative leadership think? And Boris Johnson, when he was still a newspaper journalist, said that he, in 2014, when the last time it came to Parliament, he said it was in favour. He was in favour, though he did have some fears about what he called state-approved extinction. But so that the feeling is, I don't know, the calculus depends on a whole load of different things: how much time there is, how much the government feels like sticking their neck out, whether Boris has changed his mind. But these are, those are probably indications that it would be generally supportive.
And I guess the concern, Kate, even if it did become law, the concerns about abuse of this power, about coercion, particularly for elderly people, where there are inheritance of their estate, or, it's costing a lot of money to keep them alive, concerns around people with psychological illnesses that, you could argue are treatable, and therefore, it shouldn't be a case that someone should end their lives because they're depressed, etc. Those things don't go away.
Yeah, that's true, and definitely that's what kind of campaigners against the law have been talking about and saying is a huge concern for them. But it's definitely worth noting that the proposal includes really strict safeguards. 2 independent doctors have to assess the person in question's prognosis and their mental health. A High Court judge individually will assess each request. And also, interestingly, the kind of nearest relatives of the person will also be interviewed to make sure that they have the right sort of relationship with that person, and to really ensure that it's the wish of that person and not their relatives. So there definitely are safeguards in place, and Baroness Meacher has really insisted that this law is not going to be a kind of slippery slope in terms of widening the option up for other people. She said that there's absolutely no indication that the law will be extended. And actually, even though there's huge public support for a law, there's not much support for a kind of broader law.
Okay. Theo, you're up next after this. Theo, you're finishing the show. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
This is the week that US lawmakers decided that the chips are down and they have to do something about it.
Car companies across the globe have had to idle production and workers because of a shortage of semiconductors, often referred to as microchips or just chips. They're the tiny operating brains inside just about any modern device, like smartphones, hospital ventilators, or fighter jets. The pandemic has sent chip demand soaring unexpectedly as we bought computers and electronics to work, study, and play from home. But while more and more chips are needed in the U.S., fewer and fewer are manufactured here.
Leslie Stahl hosting 60 Minutes on CBS earlier this month. Theo, she just sort of explained what microchips are, and I think we all think we know what microchips are, but since we're about to discuss microchips at length, can you just give us a brief idiot's guide? What is a microchip?
So a chip is a set of tiny electronic circuits on a sort of piece of semiconducting material, which is usually silicon. Basically, computers run on binary. The basic principle is that that means that every time a computer thinks it's a 1 or a 0, it's on or off. And these little transistors, there's lots of tiny little electric circuits that turn on or off, saying 1 or 0 very, very fast. And this is the basis of all electronics. Everything that's happened in the last 60 years all comes down to the ability to make these tiny little transistors on tiny little, well, quite small sort of chips of silicon mostly.
Yeah, this sort of like quite unsexy section of the tech industry. You know, the evolution of chips is not hailed like Apple unveiling a new shiny device, but they all incorporate chips, don't they? And now it's very much in the news. What's happened this week?
So this week's story is that the US Senate has been debating the Innovation and Competition Act, which will give massive subsidies for the tech sector, and the main bit is $50 billion to support domestic semiconductor manufacturing, which is microchip manufacturing. But the background to this is this sort of absolutely huge, great global microchip shortage, which started in the early part of the year and is showing no signs of letting up at all.
What kind of companies, what kind of products are being affected by that?
So the ones who are really in the spotlight at the moment are car manufacturers. I mean, Ford, Volkswagen, Jaguar Land Rover, BMW, Stellantis, which owns Fiat and Peugeot and lots of others, and even Toyota. They've all had to stop. They've all had to suspend production of quite a lot of their models. Appliance manufacturers are also. I mean, the point being that chips are basically in everything now. If it's got a battery or a plug, it's got a chip in it. So appliance manufacturers have been hit as well. Microsoft, Nintendo, Sony. It's why people can't get the PlayStation 5 when they want it. So if you're buying any of these things this year, anything from a washing machine to a smartphone, you probably have to pay more, and there may be quite a limited range.
Kate, have you seen any evidence of people being affected by this in the real world? Because, I mean, obviously, if you work for the mini plant in Oxford, for example, you're affected by this, and that's quite alarming if you work in the car industry. But are most of us going to feel this?
Yeah, I think this is something. I mean, when Theo proposed doing this story on the podcast, my initial response was kind of, why should we care about this? And when I started looking into it, I really began realizing that microchips, as Theo said, they are literally in everything. I mean, even if you're not in the market to buy a car anytime soon, it's likely that you'll buy a laptop or a phone or a game or kind of any sort of household product too. I think something that I felt personally quite affected by was I was reading how there's an ambulance shortage at the moment in the US as a result of the microchip shortage. I think Ford makes something like 70% of the country's ambulances, and they've had to shut down production at various plants. So there's also this real kind of public safety issue as well as a result of the shortages.
So, Suchandrika, what's stopping the microchip companies from just making many more microchips? Why is there a shortage?
Yeah, so there's been quite a few factors that have led to this. So during the pandemic, people were buying a lot more of these items that have chips in them, so like TVs, computers, video doorbells, kitchen appliances, gaming consoles. So that stock is kind of lacking. Coronavirus itself stopped workers going into the factories and people had to be socially distanced. There was that huge storm in Texas back in February, the one where the representative for Texas decided to leave, and about 12% of the world's microchips are made in the US. So this Texas storm affected the production of microchips. And then in March, the Renesas plant caught fire. As a result of this, there's even more delays, and they're not going to get back to their full production line until July. So we're still sort of on the back foot in terms of how many microchips we need.
Okay, I mean, I appreciate it's a very sophisticated process to make a microchip, Theo, but why is it so slow to turn it around? I mean, you'd have thought with such a huge billion-dollar industry, trillion-dollar industry, they could react to shortfalls like this.
It's a very complex production process. It basically takes 3 to 4 months to turn a piece of silicon into a batch of chips. And it also... They're state-of-the-art plants. They're very expensive. They have to be biosecure and keep all sorts of stuff out so that you don't get bits of dust or human skin into the process. And it's just one of those industries that swings between glut and scarcity. They call it pork cycle because it's like they first came up with pigs, because you can't suddenly produce loads of pigs for market, and it's similar to that. So yeah, they're now investing loads, and probably they're thinking that this will go on until the end of 2022 probably. But by then we'll probably have lots and lots of chips. But at the moment we don't have any. Well, we have very few.
It does really flag up how reliant we are on the super producers, doesn't it, this story? I mean, I had no idea that there's a company in Taiwan that's basically responsible for the vast majority of chips, right? And you know, we had this whole discussion about Huawei supplying British infrastructure. The chips in everything come from Taiwan.
Yeah, I don't think they do the vast majority, but they are by volume the world's largest producer. It's that, and it's TSMC, the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, and Samsung in South Korea, and Intel in America that tends to do a lot of the more sophisticated ones. And between them, they really run a lot of it.
Yeah, Suchandrika, on the question of Intel, actually, let's just focus on that for a second, because Theo mentioned the US state support that might be going to microchip manufacturers in the US. As I said, this is a huge industry, like, you know, and so are the companies that benefit from their products. I mean, why should the US government contribute to a business in which Apple and Google and Microsoft, these enormous US-based corporations, have a stake? Why can't they pay for it?
Well, it is affecting your just normal worker. So the president of CCSI International, which is a leading dog washing booth manufacturer, I will get onto that in a minute, he says that, you know, this affects all aspects of manufacturing, from little people to big conglomerates. And he talks about a rural location of the company's headquarters, which is in Garden Prairie, Illinois. And he's saying, like, you know, our workers don't have other options in terms of work. They need to get back to the factory and make these chips, which are going to these dog washing booths. Now, I didn't realise that people outsource their dog washing, but there is a lack of dog washing booths.
Don't have to if you rent a dog, of course.
Of course. Or you could rent a dog washing booth if you needed to. You never have to do it yourself. So my angle on this story really is, will somebody not think of the dogs?
I suppose as well, the other answer to state intervention in the States, Theo, is that the American companies, Apple and Microsoft and whoever, are quite happy to go to the Asian companies for their chips.
Yeah, I mean, what's been happening overall is that the designers are often in America, or even Britain's got some pretty good chip designers, but most of the production has been outsourced to Asia. And at the moment, they've suddenly, you know, in the last couple of years, they've suddenly realised, hang on, you know, these chips which power everything from tanks to jets to cars to... They're all made in Asia, and they need to be, you know, they need to have what they call tech sovereignty, i.e. have it within their own borders so they can control it. And particularly with the role of China, China is now has got a sort of massive 5-year plan to become the biggest semiconductor manufacturer. So America wants to repatriate as much of this as possible, particularly since there's always the geopolitical thing about China claiming that Taiwan is belongs to it, and therefore threatening occasionally, often by gesture rather than actual rhetoric, but to occupy it. Because if China occupied Taiwan, then suddenly it would become absolutely the world's dominant chip supplier.
Have we become, Kate, a little too dominant on chips? I mean, they were invented in 1958. They had a particular purpose in computers. We didn't need microchips in our fridges. We didn't need microchips in our cars except to power our car stereos. But now everything is just a big computer on wheels. But, if it means you can't get a fridge because it has a touch screen in it that doesn't work, did we need a touch screen in the fridge in the first place?
It is quite extraordinary to think about how they were, as you said initially, intended just to kind of power computers, but now they are everywhere. And even looking at the technology, they've developed so much over the last 50 years. The first microchips, which were developed in 1959, they were just, they were the size of a pinky finger. These days, they're the size of a penny. And actually, just 2 weeks ago, IBM announced that it had created a 2 nanometer chip, and that makes it basically the size of a fingernail. So these chips are getting smaller and smaller, which I think therefore means that they're able to be used in all sorts of devices that we wouldn't have thought possible just a few years ago.
Well, like Intel's dominance of the microchip market, this conversation has now come to an end. My thanks to Suchandrika, Kate and Theo for their stories. And remember, you can subscribe to this show for free, so make that microchip work for you. Search now for The Week Unwrapped, wherever you get your podcasts. I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer Sophie King at Rethink Audio. And until we meet again to unwrap next week, bye-bye.